Welcome everybody. This is the first module of Literacy for ELLs, English Language Learners. So the first thing we're going to ask you to do is to make sure that you very carefully look over that syllabus. And a lot of students, just take for granted that, they glance at the syllabus and they understand what's going on. But it'd be a good idea to really carefully look over this syllabus so that you know what your expectations are, you know what the projects are, and you don't keep asking the professor what's going on, because it should be all written there in the syllabus. If there are any mistakes, you will get bonus points for finding the mistakes. Another thing to keep in mind is the discussion threads. When you have these discussion threads, some of them it's your choice what you want to discuss, and some of them it's not your choice. You should discuss the specific topic in mind. Okay, so let's talk about the non-native English speakers in the U.S. schools. As you know, Northeast Ohio has a huge population of Nepali and Congolese. Those are our two primary populations of non-native English-speaking children. And those terms are kind of umbrella terms because Nepali could be Burmese, Karen, Nepali, Mon, all kinds of indigenous hill tribes that come from that area of Southeast Asia. And in terms of the Congolese, the same can be said. One of the most important things that I learned when I was visiting Akron Public Schools was I was told that this child is from the Congo, but he speaks Swahili. And Swahili is an East African language, so it means that that family has migrated or fled across the continent to try to get out and enter a refugee camp. Maybe the camp was in the Congo and the camp was in Nepal or Thailand for that matter, but the children may be of a different ethnic and racial origin. So this is something I'd like you to think about. What is school culture? What is a school? And what kind of culture does your school have? If you're not already teaching in the classroom, what kind of culture is the University of Akron as compared to a place like Kent State or a place like Harvard? What is school culture? What are the ways that school culture is formed, and how is it enacted, and how are the rules of culture done at school? So in one of your projects you're going to do is choose a book, and one of the books that I highly recommend that you look over, it's a huge thick book. I had to read it when I was in graduate school, Ways with Words by Shirley Bryce Heath. This book actually is a classic, and Shirley Bryce Heath looked at a community in the Carolinas, and she looked at 3 different groups within that community: an African American middle class, an African American working class, and a white middle class community. And she looked at the literacy practices to determine what was going on in the homes and how those practices translated over into the schools. And this was a 10-year longitudinal study. It was a very interesting work. It's classic. Every graduate student in sociolinguistics usually reads this book. And she found that the literacy practices at the home distinctly and significantly impacted how well a child did at school. And one of the things you can think about is why. Another great classic in terms of sociolinguistics and literacy is the book Blacked Out by Dr. Signithia Fordham, who looked at a all-black high school in Washington, D.C. that she named fictitiously Capitol High. And her findings were that black students, when they played the role of being a good student and succeeding in school, were chastised by their peers for pretending to be white. So again, the idea of school and culture and what is a school and who runs a school and what are the rules, overt and covert, of that school, all play out in terms of race and identity for children and teens and even adults. Invisible Culture, the third book that I highly recommend that you take a look at for your book club project, is Susan Phillips' very famous classic now, written in the 70s, about she studied a Warm Springs, Oregon reservation school. The children were born on the Warm Springs Reservation, and they went to school in the local community. And what she found was that even though the children no longer spoke their indigenous language or languages, they spoke English. The teachers also spoke English, but the teachers were middle class, predominantly white females. And there was a clash of culture and communication. And this book explains what was going on in that. It's a really insightful book in terms of learning about how our cultural norms and expectations and our cultural reality impacts the way that we communicate. So here's something I would really like you to think about. How can we support our students, seeing that we have such diversity in the world today? What can we do to best support them? Here's a couple of ideas that come from your book. Class activities. You can have them do an illustrated biography, a class map, class cultural picture board, and activities about what is culture. So you celebrate and honor the diversity in your classroom. Can you think of anything else you can do to help make students feel like their culture and language are being respected and honored? So one thing I'd like you to do as a reflective activity is to think about your name and what's in a name, and let's reflect about that. For example, my name is Valerie, and the word Valerie comes from the root valor, which means brave or courageous. My family name is Sartor. Actually, the full name, my father's full name was Sartorello, but it was cut off in Ellis Island when his father immigrated to this country. And my mother's name is Vienno, and Vienno is a very specific kind of a Finnish metaphor that means gentle. And then her last name is Vekko, Vekkomäki. It was shortened also at Ellis Island from Vekkomäki to Vekko, but Vekkomäki means quiet hills. So looking at the roots of our names and how names are said, and another thing to think about is how names are actually used. So do you call someone who is your professor, hey, Valerie? Or do you call them Valerie Sartor? Or do you call them professor? Or do you call them Professor Sartor? Or something else? It depends on your culture. In the Russian culture, it's very specific on how you address people, and it has to do with hierarchy and power. Japanese culture and Korean culture, there are honorifics and specific modes of address. And in some cultures, you never are allowed to say a person's name unless you're very intimate with them, a family member or married to that person. Another interesting fact about names is that traditionally in Mongolia, I did a lot of work with Mongolians, and in Mongolia, people only have one name, and the name is usually very poetic, like Shooting Star, or Bright Ice, or Slender Willow, things like that. They don't have family names, they just have one name. And so this actually became quite a problem when people were trying to get passports as, you know, the modern world entered into the Mongolian life. So here's another activity I'd like you to try. It's in your Bright Space. It's a rap test, and to see how well you can do with that. So I'd like you to reflect now. When you reflect, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do homework or write papers for me. It's just to take the time to sit back and think for a minute. What kind of sociocultural factors affect language use in the classroom? And what are the participant structures, the rules about when to speak and how to speak and who can speak, and the kinds of regulations in terms of language use? What are the rules in the classroom, in your classroom or in classrooms that you've observed? So there are many different kinds of cultural rules. Some of them are overt and some of them are covert. And cultural rules can be found by looking at in terms of like the superficial, the overt rules, looking at literature, looking at food, looking at dress styles, facial expressions, holidays, eating habits, you know, all the things that are above board and easy to see and recognize. But there are also very implicit, kind of covert cultural rules that we need to be aware of when we're dealing with children of diversity and their lifestyles and their worldviews, and that's under the tip of the iceberg, as you can see by this drawing. So as we near the end of this lecture, I'd like you to think about what you can do to help your students feel safe and comfortable. John Hattie has done multiple years, 40 years of research, and he says that the most important thing for children and students, and actually students of all ages, is for the teacher to create and support and advocate for a safe and welcoming classroom. So what do you do, and what can you think of doing to make your classroom safe and warm and welcoming? This is probably my least favorite slide, the current policy for English language learners. We have the ELPA standards, the ESSA, the Common Core. Common Core promotes a lot of rigor. It is an idealized thing. It's not very pragmatic. And as you know, anyone who's been in the school system and experienced it or worked in it, we have a lot of high-stakes testing going on in the United States. You know, there are some countries in the world that don't do that. For example, Finland. Children don't take standardized tests until they're about 16 years old. So, here we go back. Here. The pros and the cons. This is an idea, concept close to my heart that I'd like to talk about with you for a minute. And it is the fact that in the United States we have an English-only policy. And in our neighboring country, Canada, for example, since the 1960s, they've had a national bilingual policy, French-English. And what are the pros and the cons? So this is something that's interesting to me that I'd like to talk about, and it would be the pros and the cons of the bilingual policy in the United States. We have no bilingual policy like our neighbor Canada, which is French and English. Why does the United States promote and advocate for an English-only policy? You might want to Google that and find out. Why do you think the United States has? So this is our last slide for this lecture, and it is a slide about technology. And for our English language learners, not only do you and me and all students in the world today need to learn and keep up with technology, but also our English language learners. And the reason is that, you know, it's just the way the world is, lifestyle change. Education is changing a huge amount right now and very, very quickly. If you want to read about how the impact of technology is happening on in schools today, one of the things you might look at is Brian Alexander's blog. He's a futurist. He's a really good guy, and one of the subtitles in his blog is Technology and Education. Very interesting stuff to look at. And this is the end of our lecture, so you are free now to reflect and think and look through the rest of the stuff in this module.